There we go. Okay. Yay, I did it right for once.
We are recording. Welcome, everyone. Okay. You are at Mountain Magic in watercolor. We're going to be painting this evening with artist Claire Giordano, and we have a wonderful class ahead of you. You are here thanks to SheJumps. We are a nonprofit that's all about increasing the participation of women and girls in outdoor activities. We partner with nature to create safe educational outdoor experiences for girls and women that nurture growth and transformation. This evening, we are going to be learning watercolor skills that you can take into the outdoors and incorporate in all of your adventures. Gosh, I am so excited for this. We've hosted this class before. I'm well aware of Claire's skills and so happy that you all are learning from her this evening. Claire, I turn the stage to you.
Thank you so much, Christy. I really appreciate it. Well, hello, everybody. You can see my hands. Obviously, this is where the magic will happen today. It's on the screen. I opted out of showing my face at the same time, just because it was distracting, and last time we weren't able to get, some folks couldn't see just my hands. So you'll have to enjoy the auditory and visual adventure without my lovely face this evening. But we'll just get right in. I'd love to hear in the comments from anybody if you've taken a class from me before. And while those comments are rolling in, please go ahead and get your materials ready. I'll go over briefly what I have. And thank you so much, Christy, for that wonderful introduction. If you guys have never done anything from SheJumps, welcome to your first SheJumps event. They're just an incredible organization that I have been so honored to partner with over the last year or so for some Zoom classes. We were actually able to host, kind of before the pandemic worsened again, 2 in-person classes at Crystal Mountain, a local ski resort. And it was just such a joy to get to connect with Christy in person and that team and some amazing women from the region. It really is just so impactful to get to be painting and exploring in that kind of community that they foster. And Mandy, I see you have been in some classes before, so welcome back. That's awesome. And Christy, you guys might notice, dropped right into our chat box our reference image. So you don't have to have it, but I know there's always occasionally folks who get really stoked about seeing what I was working from originally. So please feel free, if you'd like to open that up on a separate screen or whatever it is, that reference image is there now in the chat for everybody. And if somebody else, if you notice, if they join a little bit later and they can't find it, just copy and paste that for them and they can be able to see it as we go along. But I'll slowly clear all of my fun little treasures from hiking trips and plants around the house. And this is where we're headed with our painting. So excited. This is Mount Rainier. And gosh, this is a painting that I have done a couple of versions of now for different classes. And it's one of my favorites. It's a monochrome painting. So I'm using this single kind of dark blue pigment made by Daniel Smith. Please just use whatever dark colored pigment you have. So if you have a paint that you like, that's a dark, brown or a black or, whatever it is, the darker the color, the better. The main thing is you want a kind of a shade of pigment that can go very, very light when it has a lot of water added, and then one that can go a lot darker when it has less water added. So that's why I default to this one. I have other favorites that work really well for monochrome paintings, but this one's just kind of extra fun because it's blue instead of just a black or a gray. So I enjoy that. Which means I always get asked, so I show it off anyway. If I am working in the field, I will work with a much bigger complement of colors. On a rare occasion, I'll do a monochrome outside, but I usually get too excited about all of the beautiful colors in the landscape. So this is a palette made by a wonderful local artisan up in Port Townsend, Washington. They're little magnetic pans that actually pop out, so I can change out my colors depending on where I am in the world. The company's called Art Toolkit. So I love to kind of show off her beautiful work because I've been using her palettes now for over 10 years. And they're just so fun. And they're like, this is the biggest one she has now. I don't think I have. There's a mini one that's the size of my palm, and it's just the cutest thing of all time. I don't have it with me right now, but that's kind of fun too. And I'll get this out of the way. My nice glass table from my desk, because if anyone has tried to paint watercolor on a surface that is like a wooden table for real, then the paint just soaks everywhere. So having a glass surface was kind of a lifesaver earlier, a couple of years ago. And I'm just gonna get my nice piece of paper out here to start. So I have 2 pieces of paper here. The first one is kind of our practice paper, and that's the one that we'll start on just to kind of practice some of the techniques, get kind of warmed up and just enjoy you know, playing with watercolor. Because I feel like so often watercolor can kind of be this big, intimidating, scary medium. And I just invite all of you to kind of let go of those expectations and just enjoy some experimentation. And however the painting turns out tonight, hopefully it's still a fun adventure along the way. And you can't see much of a difference here, but I'll be doing the actual demo of our kind of Mount Rainier scene on this paper right here, which is an 8 by 10 inch piece of 100% cotton paper made by Arches. And there's a lot of really great papers out there. I default to this one because I was able to buy a bunch on sale recently. So usually my paper choice is dictated by sale, but also whichever ones give me the effects that I desire. These different papers will give you different abilities to do different things with your paint and your amount of water on that page. So I'll put that aside for now. A little pro tip on the back of your paper, always mark what the back and the front is. So I put a little X, and oftentimes I didn't have it today because I just tore it, but I will label what this paper is. It's an Arches cold press. Because otherwise you end up with dozens of little pieces of paper and you have no idea which one is which. So after about doing that five or six times, I finally got smart and started labeling everything. As for the rest of our tools, I'm keeping it very, very simple. I have a pencil, an eraser. I have a little paper towel that I'm going to use just to kind of dry the brush off or lift off paint if I want to. And I really love these kind of blue shop towels. They're the most eco-friendly I've found because I can reuse them for a super duper long time. So I've had some that I use for like 2 to 4 years, depending on, eventually they get really painty, but then you just like put them in the water under this in a sink and just squeeze out all the paint. And then they are pretty much good to go back out in the field again. This one's just like, I can't recall the brand, Allie, but they're blue shop towels. So if you walk into like a Home Depot, or if you look online or even on Amazon, you can find them. They're really great. They're pretty easy to find. And I'll be sending you guys at the end of the lesson, either Christy or I, or through SheJumps, we'll get you an email with some extra resources. And it will include a resource guide, and it talks about all the materials in way more depth than I can go into now. So, and I don't think that one has any links, but if someone can't find it, you're always welcome to just shoot me an email and I can help you out. And then for our brush, I'm going to keep it quite simple. I was going to get a bigger one, but I decided just to stick with the smaller because I really don't need anything bigger. This is a number 10 round. This one's made by Grumbacher, and honestly, you can have paintbrushes from many different brands and they'll work very, very comparably. I'm using a synthetic paintbrush, which means these beautiful little bristles up here are usually plastic of some kind, and they're not natural hairs like from sable or horse or whatever. The reason for that is that I am very hard on my brushes. They are unceremoniously shoved into a bag, dropped in glacial dirt. A few have rolled off rock before quite a ways. And the really expensive brushes, I was too hard on them and they were falling apart too quickly. So I defaulted to an affordable brush when I buy them. I buy them half off whenever I find them at Michael's or online, whenever I see them on sale. And these will last me about 6 months with heavy use, because the tip eventually will get a little less kind of prominent and pointy. This one's after a summer of adventures, it's starting to get frayed a little bit. But for most folks who aren't going out painting a ton, especially with like sand in their palette, then they last a lot longer, for years for most folks. So that's my brush I'll be using. And that about covers it for our paint. And I will be putting my paint into a palette next to my painting. So that clinking sound is a beautiful little porcelain palette I got. I think I got it for like $20 from the Daniel Smith store years ago. And so my paint, everyone's always curious, it actually comes in a tube just like this. And I can kind of squeeze a little dot in there into a well in my palette. And then that's how I get some really nice concentrated color. Note, if you're using paint straight out of a tube, this is so much more concentrated than the equivalent here. And they're the same paint, but when it dries, if you swipe your brush through this, you're going to get less paint. If you swipe your brush through that, you're going to get a ton of paint. So if you're using the wet paint, I recommend just kind of making a nice little puddle kind of next to it with water. Then you can just kind of swirl your brush into the edge of that paint. Then you can get some on your brush and have more control over the amount you get. And if you're in a pan, then you can just kind of make a nice little puddle of paint on the top. And every time you swipe your brush, you'll be able to get paint off of there. You can see it's already dripping on the palette. So there's the kind of preview of the materials. Any questions there about what I just went over? I don't spend too long on materials either. you know, we have a very nice limited palette today. So that makes our materials much more simple than if we're working with lots of colors. Thanks, Christy, for putting that link up. Awesome. So if you haven't already, go ahead and get out a piece of scrap paper of some kind. I should mention the brand of the scrap paper. This is a piece from a big Canson XL pad of watercolor paper. So I buy those big pads and you can tear it down or just buy a smaller one. And they're super affordable. So they're like so nice. But that paper, the one downside of it is that it's non-archival. So this paper, I would never want to put a painting I was going to sell or one I really, really cared about lasting more than, you know, it'll last a handful of years, but it will yellow in less than 2. So that's why I use these for practice and warm-ups and technique adventures, but never for a painting that I would want to last longer than that for me. Okay. So we'll dive right in and we'll spend probably 10 or 15 minutes or so just kind of practicing some of the techniques that we'll need for our painting. So I found it to be really helpful, you know, when I'm trying to approach a painting with that spirit of exploration rather than expectation, to kind of just give myself a chance in the beginning to get warmed up, get the jitters out, and also just to try a bunch of new stuff, and then, you know, try not to get too worked up about being perfect from the get-go. So I want you just to kind of smear your paintbrush around in your paint and get it loaded up with a little bit of paint on there. And I'm kind of trying to get a nice middle amount of paint. So not too dark, not too light, kind of right in the middle. So I'm using all this mixing space to do that. So over here on my page, I'm just going to try making some marks. I'm going to try making some kind of more linear marks. I'm going to try making some curved marks. And just kind of get to know that paintbrush. Especially if I've been away from paint for a little while, it can be really nice and really refreshing just to play a little bit and see what kind of brushes I can, or what kind of strokes I can make with that brush on my paper. And once you've had a chance to make just kind of a bunch of random marks, then I encourage you to try and see what happens if you maybe make some lines where the kind of width changes as you change the pressure of your brush stroke. So what I mean by that is if I start with minimal pressure, then increase the pressure as I go from left to right. I start with a fine line and it thickens up to a wider line. Or if I do the opposite and I start with a bunch of pressure and then let up, and I can see how kind of different my brush strokes can look from side to side. And after that, I might see if I can kind of get fancy and try to make a continuous line where I'm increasing and decreasing pressure all in the same line. Maybe I'll try to even do the same thing with a curved line to kind of see if I can make some kind of wave shapes that go thinner and then thicker down that page. So I found over time that one of the hardest things about watercolor is just kind of understanding how our brush works. Both it's, you know, how much paint we have on there, how much water, and then how much pressure we add, as well as how we hold that paintbrush. So for strokes like this, I'm usually holding it kind of like I would as a pencil. And I know I'm holding it slightly wrong. My teachers in elementary school could never break me of holding it the wrong way. So it's stuck. They certainly try. They're like, oh, write cursive. I don't know if any of you, I feel like I was one of the last generations that was required to learn how to draw or how to write in cursive. It never stuck, but I did learn. And then, you know, part of that, they make you hold your pencil a certain way. And I think I had my rebellious phase in the cursive class. I just never wanted to participate in that part. All right, so now we got a chance to do that. We can move on to the next phase. So this is kind of like if we just used our brush like a pencil or a pen with color. But of course, that's only half the magic of our medium. The other part of this medium is that we can do a lot with water. So one of the coolest things we can do is we can put some paint down. We can dip that paintbrush in our water, clean off most of the paint, and just overlap the tip of that paintbrush with that wet zone. Just move that brush side to side, moving it down with each brush stroke, and we can draw that color down the paper. So this is literally called a color drawdown, where we start with a darker area and we thin it out with water. But what I love about this is it gives us a chance to see kind of those magical properties, you know, how we get this kind of like ethereal flowing of the water and letting the water take over a lot of the work for us and just trusting it will make some beautiful patterns on our paper. And I do a lot of painting like this where I'll put lines down and then blend or soften them to varying degrees. Because we can do it for a big swath like that. Or maybe we imagine, and you guys can all try this with me, we have some kind of rocks on a mountainside. So if you imagine there's some rocks on a little hill or something, if I want to kind of soften the bottom of those lines, I can do the same thing, rinse that paintbrush off most of the way, and then I can come in here and blend that color down. And when I blended the color right there, I had a lot of water on my brush. I hadn't tapped, I hadn't removed much of it. So if I go on the paper towel and kind of tap some of that water off, and I have less, you can see how much less water it leaves behind on my hand. And if I come over here and try to blend this down, you'll see how much less the paint kind of filled in that area. So there's kind of two things to be aware of there. Just, how many times you go back and forth with the brush, and then how much water we have. So if I'm working in more detailed zones like this, I'll very often try to have kind of just not a dry brush, but just like a less wet brush. And when I'm working in big areas like this for skies and where I want the billowy atmospheric effects, I'll work with more water on the brush. Those are kind of two things to consider as we're rolling. And I can even write on, if that's helpful, so this is less water, and this is more water. For visual folks who like to see the labels. I'm a really big fan of labels. If any of you have followed me for a long time, I love making nicely arranged pages, but it's also fun sometimes just to kind of build it as I go along and not worry about how the end layout will be. And so is that making sense to folks? Just kind of as we start to play with, seeing how our water and our paint can start to interact with each other. If you have any questions, just go ahead and drop them into that chat. The next thing I wanted to do, and this is something I've just recently started doing in lessons, is just to kind of make a little value scale. So I want to start, I had a clean brush and I picked up just a tiny bit of paint. I'm going to make a nice little kind of swatch on my paper. So that's kind of nice to put that down. I'm going to see if I can make an even lighter one by dipping that brush in the water. And there we go. You can see I can make the lightest light. And then in like 5 or 6 more steps, I'm just going to kind of tap that brush and add progressively more paint to my little swatches as I go down my page. So I'm trying to make kind of a nice little range from light to more concentrated. And I'm kind of, if I don't have enough paint in a swatch, there's no difference there. I'll just go ahead and go back to my paint and grab some more. So now I actually have a difference there. So I'm not going to go too overboard here. I'm just going to have this be my final swatch right there. And I find this to be really, really impactful. So this is called a value scale. And this is super important for the kind of painting we're making today, because when we're working in a monochromatic painting, we have to tell the entire story with one color. So that's where having an awareness of how much paint and how much water we need to get a really, really light color versus a really, really dark saturated color comes in handy. So I find that practicing those value scales can actually be a really powerful tool in any kind of landscape, whether it's the one we're doing right now, a monochrome landscape, or I have another example over here that you might be interested to see. This was from a recent class I filmed for my Adventure Art Academy students, where we were talking about all the different color combinations for an alpenglow scene. And you can see here the same idea of kind of, what's our value, our paint? Are we really highly saturated? Are we in a dark value? Or are we in a very light value, like we see for that glowing snow effects? And I can use the same exact colors, the same base colors to create glowing snow, as well as crazy, vibrant, illuminated rock in that sunshine. So that's where an understanding of value is really key to watercolor, I think, kind of across the board. So it's really nice and fun to be able to kind of, and I found that for me, when I work on monochrome paintings, that's where I built that initial awareness, honestly, of value, was through doing a lot of paintings that just had a single pigment and really learning how to refine and be able to work with this limited kind of scale. Is that, and again, if you have any questions, comments, aha moments, not aha moments, drop them in the chat so I can know that you guys are all following along. Okay, for guys and gals. I also just find value scales incredibly satisfying. And if you've never done this for your favorite colors, go do it tomorrow. It's like a little bit mind boggling to actually break them down and see just how many values you can get with a single color. I find it to be so helpful. Whenever I get a new color, it's the very first thing I do is I'm like, oh, what can I do? And if you're, kind of lazy like me sometimes, you don't feel like making every little swatch, then you can always, I'll use a different color just for an example. You can always just say, okay, you know what? I want to do a kind of quick and dirty value scale, which would just be to put a nice, really dark color swatch on your page. And then I kind of rinse that brush a tiny bit and I slide it down and blend it across the page, rinse that brush some more. So we're doing kind of just like a longer, more drawn out drawdown of that color. So you can do kind of a quick and dirty value scale. And both of these are showing the same thing, just one more clearly than the other. Okay. And, you know, if you feel like you want to do your whole painting in this bright, vibrant phthalo green, like you go for it. I choose kind of a nice, more neutral color, but I definitely had some amazing results from some classes of our students, just like an entire like mountain in pink. And it's just the coolest thing. So don't ever feel that you have to be are restricted to the colors that I use. And I encourage you to use whatever you have on hand. So this painting, in addition to having kind of elements of blending, also has a sky. I know the skies can be very intimidating for folks sometimes. So I'm going to make a little box on my paper. Normally I have a smaller palette to make a smaller box, but I'm terrible at drawing boxes. So I use the palette. It's my ruler in the field, because otherwise my boxes end up looking like lopsided triangles inevitably. So I I have a little shortcut there. So a little fun pro tip for painting in the field is just use that palette as your straight edge. The rulers, they're always so small and they're usually clear, and I inevitably like almost leave them behind. My friends will find them and I'm like, oh, I forgot that 5 miles ago. Thanks for grabbing that. So for our sky, probably the quickest and easiest way that I want to do it with us tonight is just, we'll start out by, we can just get this whole area kind of wet. And if you have a smaller brush like I do, you might have to kind of work to get that water to fill the whole area. So you can see how I'm working in this color here. And what I'm doing is I'm just working in this water. I'm looking for an even amount of sheen across the entire zone. So thankfully my lamp on my desk makes it pretty easy to see that, you know, if I kind of put a puddle on this paper, I don't want puddles like this over here, where if I tilt the paper, it runs across the page. I want to avoid that. So if I get puddles, you can just swipe your brush through it and then tap a paper towel or a cloth. And then you can get all that extra off. So that kind of gives me a nice controlled way to add or remove water. So once I have an even sheen across the entire thing, I'm going to want to be able to tilt my paper. So I'm going to lift it and kind of tilt the backside up a couple inches back here. I'm going to load up that paintbrush with a bunch of beautiful paint. I'm not going for the darkest color I can make. I want it somewhere kind of, you know, in this zone of the value scale, because we'll save our darkest darks for our mountain and our foreground. I'm going to load up some paint and then drop that paint into the top of that zone. And I'll let gravity and capillary action do the magic for me. So that's where that paint is being pulled through the water down the paper. And sometimes I'll get a little weird thing like that. Like, I don't know what's happening there. I can put more paint in there and kind of let it blend downward. If you have a ton of water and it's like, you know, puddling, this might carry all the way down. But the goal here is that by having an even amount of shine, but not puddling water, then we are able to have cool pigment patterns created, but not so much that we kind of lose control of what's happening. Even though I know this can feel like a big surrender of control, because we're letting this paint and just trusting it to do cool things on our paper. And very often it works the best just with this kind of paper I'm on right now. I have a little kind of narrow window, like right now where it's still wet, where I can add some more paint, but that window will start to close very fast. If anyone has worked with watercolor for any amount of time, you'll know that it's a very unpredictable and fickle medium. And the minute it gets too dry, it will just start making splotchy things everywhere. So I usually just try to add if I want any darker color right away and not let it drag on too long to have that paint. Otherwise, I'll get kind of interesting streaky things happening in that sky. So I give everybody a chance to try that technique out. In our sky, in addition to kind of this cool atmospheric effect, we do also need to have a way to kind of add a little bit darker value above our mountain. So if you want to, you can kind of pencil in like a little ridgeline silhouette at the bottom here. I'm going to dip my brush in some clean water. And that's a little bit dark. So if you get a really dark color, you can just kind of wipe it off, add some more water. And I'm just going to trace that pigment right up to this kind of ridgeline at the bottom, and then blend that paint right up into my white zone below my cool atmospheric clouds. And the reason I like to show this is because you can see down here how these are my hills right in here, but those hills are given definition by the contrast between the painted and the unpainted area. Because we can now imagine these are maybe snow-covered hills. So it's the key here is that contrast. So we have to, and in our painting, we'll want to do the same thing. We'll need to have enough blue, but not so much, but enough blue right above our mountain, this kind of nice light color or whatever color you're using, to be able to make that snow, that white of the paper, really stand out distinctly as actually white. Because watercolor, there's no back button. I wish there was backspace. I wish there was a way to bring the white back. But really, honestly, once it's gone, it's gone. You can kind of come back in and, like, you know, if you really want to, you can try taking a paper towel and you can kind of tap that towel into some of that, you know, painted area, and you can add in some cool cloud looking shapes. And that can be a really awesome technique that you can try in your painting. I do that all the time. But you can see that even with that tapping, I'm never going to go back to the white of that paper. So that's why when we're working in monochrome, especially, we have to kind of keep our eye always on what areas have to be white and what areas can we afford to have some paint go on because we're going to layer or go back to it again, or we want it to be darker. But yeah, so there's our fun little sky exercise. I got a question from Catherine asking, do I ever highlight with gouache when you are working in the studio or in the field? It's a great question, Catherine. So gouache is an opaque pigment. I actually do have some in my field palette right here, this white. And to be honest, I don't use it that often. I will use it, honestly, if I want to make a kind of more opaque, heavier looking color. But I've sadly found that, and I can even show it right here, gouache will never be as luminous as just the white of the paper. Just by its nature, it's an opaque pigment, so it will never behave the same with light as our beautiful watercolor does. As you can see how if I put a line of white gouache that's kind of as thick as I can make it, you know, I can cover up those dark lines, but it doesn't seem to glow in the way that like this does. So I do use it, but if I use it, it's usually for not to bring back the white of the paper, if that makes sense to your question, Catherine. It's more like in select spots to add, like, you know, a little strand of grass, or if I made a mistake and I want to like have something in the foreground be heftier, but very rarely, at least for me, I can't get it to work super well in the background. And there are times in skies where it can be beautiful, but it has to be done in like a really, at least for me, a really kind of interesting and controlled way where I'm dropping that white into very wet paint and letting it create some really cool patterns. And as it dries, you can see how that gouache also darkens when it dries, and it will never be quite as glowy as our paper. Because what happens is, you know, our light is hitting our paper and it's going through the pigment, bouncing off the white of the paper, and then coming back toward our eyes. So if we have these opaque pigments, it's just going to be kind of disturbing the quality of that light, because we won't have as purely of a reflective surface anymore, because that light's filtered through all that paint. All right, great question, Catherine. And the last thing we get to play with is some trees, yay, because we have some trees that are kind of far away-ish. They have some kind of angled little bits from branches, but they're mostly going to be kind of little upright trees. So there's kind of two ways I like to approach trees. The first is for our little kind of nubbins, these little trees that are like the really far away ones. They look hard, but they're not. So I want everybody to draw with their paintbrush an imaginary little hillside. So I'm gonna have one down here. There's a little hillside. And for our trees, I'll do it next to my hillside to start, and load up with quite a bit of paint. I'm going to switch how I'm holding my brush. And you can try both ways, but usually I find it easier like this. So instead of in pencil orientation, I'm now in kind of this like more kind of vertical, I call it like a tree painting orientation. And with this, I have kind of a lot more ability to make kind of up and down strokes. And with our trees, I want to start with minimal pressure and increase that pressure as I go down with that brush stroke. So I'm increasing the pressure as I go top to bottom. And I also want to vary the height of those trees. So if I make them all the same height, then we get what I call jailhouse trees, where we have, okay, you know, tree, tree, tree. I'm counting down the minutes until I'm done painting my trees. And that's just kind of boring. So by varying pressure and height of our trees, we can make kind of organic, really organic looking trees very quickly. If I demonstrate that on this little false hillside here, you can see how pretty quickly, and to take some practice to get speedy at it, but just by varying that height and also by varying the width or thickness of those trees and filling in down below, I can get a really nice, and it looks super organic and atmospheric, and it's a way to cover a ton of ground really fast. So inevitably I'll be painting a row of trees and I'll be like, I'm done. And I just resort to doing this to kind of fill in below them because it looks like trees or foliage or whatever you want to have that zone be. So I can break that down one more time for folks, because I know it can be hard to see the first time around. So, and I want, before I break it down again, I'll also show that if you end up with trees that are too spaced out, don't worry, because you can always just come right back in and you can just kind of fill in those gaps with more trees. And then you can kind of overlap and layer them until you get the desired amount of organic and kind of filled in or open amount of, or open kind of open-ended trees in the bottom. And the really kind of somewhat key thing here, like the most organic looking, will be if I can add that kind of and draw down that paint when that line of trees is still wet. If that line of trees dries, you can imagine I have another line up here. Then I want to go kind of blend those trees down. I'll get a little bit of a line kind of right there. So it might take the addition of a bit more paint and kind of some scrubbing to get that line to kind of disappear with time. And if the really precise kind of up and down brushstrokes aren't working for you, you can also try the kind of speedy method, which is just to kind of push that brush up and down. And if you have a pointy brush that isn't too soft, then the pushing it up and down method honestly does work. Like I can get very similar looking trees. They'll be a little bit blunter, and I'll have to kind of make some of them very intentionally like taller with the other method. But that can kind of be a shortcut for folks if this is feeling kind of inaccessible for your painting techniques right now. Hopefully that's fun. I know it can be stressful the first time you try it, so don't worry, just do your best. We'll have an entire 10-inch width to practice that on our actual painting. Any questions about our trees far away technique? Okay, and the last component that I want to show everyone for our trees is just how to add some kind of nice little branches to our trees, because our trees have branches. So the way to handle that is that if I have kind of, here's my hillside, and I have all my nice little, kind of my trees far away that I can add very quickly onto here just to kind of fill it in. And I can do the up and down pushing method of the brush, or I can do the kind of controlled, up, top, down. It's also important to note, or helpful to note, you don't want to have too much paint on your brush. If you have a huge painty glob, like if I just like get as much paint as I can on that brush, I'm going to get really broad, thick kind of wet tree lines. So instead I want to kind of squeegee off that paint and go for, it's like my brush is, you can see how by when I squeegee it on the palette, it goes from broad on one side and really thin on the other. And that's just from kind of doing this on the corner. And by doing that, if I have enough paint on there, it'll just kind of firm up that tip a little bit. So that I can go back and I can get those more kind of tall and lengthy trees. So then let's say I want to add in a tree somewhere in here that actually has some more kind of definition to it. Having that more precise brush stroke is super helpful. So I'll put the trunk in first. And ideally I'd have a reference image, but you don't have to have one. I can just kind of start putting in some little lines side to side. And the key here is just to make sure that we're not making this tree perfectly symmetrical. So I don't want the branches on one side to exactly mirror the other. Because if I were to do that like right here, then it just kind of looks pretty artificial to have those branches be perfectly mirrored. So instead, if we can just kind of space out those branches, and you can put like little tiny sparse ones up top and like a whole bunch on one side, because they're alpine trees, so they're kind of jacked up anyway, because they have a really harsh environment. And there we go. So it doesn't take much. So go ahead and take some time to kind of practice painting some nice asymmetrical trees, where the best way to make a tree is to embrace the asymmetry of that tree. That's my one bad pun for the night, I promise. And I forgot to mention as well that we will take a little break, a 5-minute break at the halfway mark. So when it hits around 7 or thereabouts, or whatever, we have a good point to stop and wander off between paint layers, we'll go take a little break. But I am ready to keep rolling right into our main painting. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat, or hold your peace until I can address them going forward. So I will always pause and see them if I can. So that's where we're headed. I'm going to go to my nice piece of watercolor paper. And if you don't have different paper for your painting, don't worry about it. The only reason I paint on a nicer sheet is just that it gives me a little bit longer dry time. So that way I can kind of keep things a little bit wetter. So what a cotton paper will, oops, did you guys lose me? Nope, am I still there? Okay. Can someone drop in the chat and just make sure that you can still see me okay? All right, I think I can see myself on the screen. All right, thanks so much, Rebecca. Awesome. Just wanted to make sure. Great, you guys are all still there. Okay, yeah, perfect. Because before it was showing my view here and also up above, so I'm glad. I appreciate that. Yep, so what I was saying was that our cotton paper will take longer to dry. So basically it allows me to have a wet paper longer. So if you all have questions about how to change something, my paper hasn't dried yet. If you have the paper I was working on before, which is a tree-based paper, that will dry much more rapidly because it's tree fibers instead of cotton. There's a bad joke in there somewhere about like a wet t-shirt contest, but it just takes longer to dry. So I'm going to switch, put the paintbrush aside, grab my pencil, and we're going to dive into the sketching portion. So this will go somewhat quickly. Like I'm not going to be too speedy, but just don't worry about it. If your mountain isn't perfectly Mount Rainier shaped, that's okay. And there's a recording, so if you get behind on something, you can always come back to it later. But the way that I approach a sketch is that I want to start with kind of like, what are the biggest lines of this painting? And if this is where we're headed, the biggest lines are obviously the top silhouette of Mount Rainier, as well as this kind of delineating space where the trees kind of meet this foreground. And if anyone took a look at that reference image, again, you don't have to, you can work what I'm doing here. You'd notice that I kind of simplified and blended and ignored a lot of stuff in that reference image. That's intentional. We want to make this painting doable in now an hour and a half. So we have to not be afraid to ignore a lot, which is to me like one of the most fun things about an artist is I get to say, I want to paint that and I don't want to paint that. So we're just not going to bother. So the first and biggest line that I'm going to start with is that kind of baseline, which is going to be about a quarter of the way up my page. So if I'm, if I really want to be precise about it, I can make a little mark here. I can use my pencil as a measurement tool. So I'm measuring from here to here, translate that to the other side, make a little mark over there. And then I know that I'm roughly the same kind of height on both sides. And somehow I did not get that the same. So I always double check because that line should actually be down there. And some artists will get super precise with like their perspective and having everything lined up exactly. I've never been that way. I'm just a really big fan of just going for it and trying. And if the worst that happens is we waste a piece of paper and make a big mess, and then we have a really fun thing to look back on with all that we learned. So I'll just start by kind of blocking in this bottom section. I'll put kind of a little, little hill dip in the middle, kind of goes up a little bit over here, and it kind of goes that way. And I might even intentionally have this side be a little bit higher now, just to add some visual interest so it isn't all the same all the way across. I don't want this dip to be perfectly in the middle. So if our middle is here, it's just offset a little bit to the left. All right, and then once I have that, I know that I want the top of Mount Rainier to kind of fall roughly 2/3 of the way up. The reason for that is if I go back to, where is it? This thing's too wet to draw on. So I can draw on the back of here. Oh, I already have one. So this is from a lesson months and months ago. So this is kind of, if you imagine this is our piece of paper. If we divide that piece of paper into thirds horizontally and vertically, then our ideal composition, or one that will be really pleasing to the eye, will have kind of Mount Rainier falling about 2/3 of the way up, and then having our trees kind of fall roughly 1/3 or 1/4 of the way up. So you don't have to stick to this rule. It's called the rule of thirds, but I do find that I really enjoy it, especially for landscapes that are dominated by really big mountains. I just find that it helps make it feel more cohesive. Because if I put Rainier smack dab in the middle, it can just feel kind of overwhelming. And it is in the middle, but I'm offsetting the summit ever so slightly to the left. So with that in mind, I'm going to start this edge of Mount Rainier roughly halfway up or thereabouts. And to begin, I'm just going to make kind of a nice bell curve shape. So I'm not trying to get any really big details. I'm just trying to kind of get that rough shape of Mount Rainier. Like if I ignored every single detail, I want just the rough shape to be in my painting right now. So making that kind of rough line where the left is higher than the right. Then once I have that shape, then I can kind of come back in here and start kind of adding in some of the detail, like for what I believe is Liberty Ridge over here. If anyone knows Mount Rainier better than me, feel free to correct me with the locations at any time. And the summit is, kind of curves, and it has like a little sub-summit thing over here to the right. And I'm working from my painting instead of the reference image, so I can see myself in the other screen in the chat box. So just a little heads up there, like it's not going to be, I'm a few steps removed now from that reference image, which is good though, because it encourages some additional simplification of that scheme. So that's about what I wanted. I have to decide, is this too perfectly curved here and too perfectly curved over here? I think it is. Like, this doesn't seem to dip down enough. So if that's the case, I can come back in with that eraser, erase a little bit of that. I can even decide that that's, not quite the way I want it to be. And I'm going to actually open up that reference image just because I'm very curious now to actually see it and make sure I'm somewhat close to how the top of that mountain works. There we go. Yeah, so, I wasn't too far off. Like, I'm intentionally making the summit a little bit less broad compared to my photo, just because I think that will look better. So if you notice that, that's an intentional change from that photo. And here's our kind of, whatever this formation is that sticks out over here to the right, kind of big block of rock and things over here. And then this kind of comes over like that and then goes down. Okay, and I'm double checking. The left side actually is kind of boring. Like, let's be real. There's really not many bips and bobbles of texture happening in that side. So I can erase my little smooth guiding line, kind of put in like whatever that little angled bit is. And I might even artificially angle, give a bit more texture to parts of that weren't there before. And if you had a guiding line that was really that first one that you could really see, you can always erase it or just leave it. I'm gonna bring back up Zoom so I can see you guys' notes in the chat if they come up. And then from here, I'm gonna try to do just the very bare minimum for my rocks. Like, I really do not want to get too bogged down in them, just because if we imagine that we're painting out in the field, it would be just stressful to try to sketch every single rock perfectly. It's just not gonna happen for me, let's be real. Very often I will try to make my whole sketch for a painting of this size in 5 minutes or less, sometimes 10. And if I'm working bigger, like 11 by 14, I'll also try to keep my sketch as fast as possible. So with these, you'll notice I'm just kind of making kind of rough marks of where the rocks go. I don't want to get too precise, just because I want to leave some space for myself to have some curiosity and some mistakes and some unhappy and happy accidents with paint on the painting. Because so much of, I feel like, watercolor is just about letting that paint really have some freedom on the page. And if I plan everything out too perfectly, then I often find that my paintings look kind of less, they might be more realistic in terms of a replica of a photo, but they will have less of the feeling of what that place was. And very often I'm trying to tell a bigger story of what it was like to be there, or what were the observations I was making of a changing landscape. And I will occasionally double check and be like, what, this all got way too far to the right. So if that happens, don't be afraid. Just be like, all right, that thing got too big. You put the eraser through it and just chop down the entire shape and say, okay, that's better. That's more where that needs to be. This one needs to be more here. And then this little guy comes in right in here, this kind of little rock band. And over here, we have kind of this big, thick, chunky area happen in that zone. And the beautiful thing about doing a zoomed out mountain like this is that even if the rocks are not all perfectly placed, folks will still be able to recognize them as Mount Rainier. And then down here, so as long as we have the major landmarks, then we're good to go. And then down here, I'm gonna try not to draw too much, just kind of like where it's a little bit darker zones, because we're going to just kind of blend some paint down there and let that really just kind of have some freedom along the bottom. And the trees, if I was doing this on my own, if I wasn't part of a class, I would just not draw in any of the trees at all. But if you find it comforting to have a couple of the taller ones kind of put in, then go ahead and do so. Like, I just put kind of little vertical lines to tell me I'm going to have some taller ones there. I'm going to have a couple taller ones here. And that's not to imply that if we, love sketching, that's not to put that down. Just that if I'm thinking about trying to be as speedy as possible, oftentimes keeping a sketch this minimal can save me a lot of time when I'm working outside. Okay, so we are right on schedule. So this will give us the perfect amount of time to get our skies put in, and then we'll take that break. And then when we come back, our skies will be more on the way to drying out for us, which will be nice. So before I dive into that sky though, any lingering burning questions about the sketch or how that process went down? I did it in roughly real time. Again, I'm leaving some extra time for folks to catch up now too. And don't forget, don't be shy with your questions. In my mind, there is no such thing as a stupid question. And I truly mean that. I know it can feel like we might be totally alone with what we feel like is a stupid question, but every single class that's happened in, I guarantee you someone else has had that question. And usually in the comments, many others are like, oh my gosh, me too. So don't be shy. I'm also leaving some space here for folks to catch up on that sketch if you feel like you fell behind a little bit. And in case it's helpful, I can put the actual painting. What's more helpful for folks? You want to see the painting while you're sketching, or do you want to see my sketch? Let me know in the chat which one you like better. And Kelly had a great question. Do I usually end up erasing my pencil sketch after my paint has dried? Sometimes, not all the time. Usually I will erase the lines that are focused kind of along the upper side of the mountain, just because they can be distracting where it's pure white snow. And sometimes I kind of love the magic of leaving those pencil marks behind. I wonder if I can find one for you guys that has those marks left. Let me take a look in my little pile of paintings over here. Well, this one has pencil and ink. This is a painting from last year, and it was a much, the whole thing was like, I think a half an hour of painting. So I tried to work really fast and much more impressionistically. So that's where you can see there's lots of pencil lines left in and a lot of loose ink lines left in as well. So kind of depends on the painting and the vibe I'm going for. But if it's like rocky scenery and not just the very summit of a mountain, oftentimes I find the pencil kind of nice. They just add extra texture. I heard from Nancy that this is helpful for you all. So there you go. Awesome. And for a class like this, we're working live, but then other times when I've been teaching my other series of classes where I film most of the lesson outside, when I get back, I'll come back and make a really nice sketch like this for everyone to download. And I have some students who trace it, some who just use it for reference, but that way you can have like a fully kind of defined, either with just line work or with some values put in to kind of help demystify that kind of back end a little bit. I didn't have that for this. I may have to make it next time I teach this class just so you can see that fully sketched out version. But I never add that amount of detail in my actual painting. That's just to be helpful for students. Here's a better example of like the actual lines for that painting I showed before. Like my sketch was this simple. Just, delineating rock, trees, a little bit background rock, and that was it. And trying to leave a lot of the rest to be magical for the watercolor itself. And Michelle asked, do I tend to ink the pencil line? I find that when I'm working in the field, I work with a lot more ink than I just for the outlines I do at home. In the studio, I have a more controlled environment. So I am able to, with a hairdryer, dry it, things dry faster. In the field, I find that ink often adds it helps liberate me a little bit from having to be as precise. So I'm trying to find an example. I can just reach a pile of paintings over here. Here we go. That'll work. So while I'm giving you all a chance to catch up, here's an example from a recent trip to the Olympics. And you can see that, well, that one I didn't do ink, but in the sketches down below, I left everything with the ink in it. But normally I would add ink here, but I had extra time. It's maybe not the most effective example there. Let's see. This one, not a good example. Here's a good example. Okay. So this is a fun one. This is an Alpenglow painting that I actually am I'm so excited. I'm going to be launching for the online students who are part of the Adventure Art Academy. And I'll be sending you guys a link for that at the end, and also in the follow-up email if you're curious. This was such a fun one. It's a beautiful scene, but you can see how much ink there is there, because I found that ink was very comforting when I had to work really quickly and with a very complicated scene with just so much light happening. And I actually ran out of time when I was doing the ink because the light show started. So all the ink down here was added after the fact. So never be afraid to just kind of bounce around your medium and just, embrace the unpredictability of a landscape. So that's totally fine. And it happens all the time. I'm like, actually, I want 2 times as much ink or not. So I'll come back and add that later. But hopefully you all have a chance to add your sketch So I'm actually going to, oh, thanks so much, Catherine. I appreciate her comment. She's one of the students in the Adventure Art Academy. I've just been having so much fun the last 6 months making all those classes for everyone outside. So I mentioned it not to be markety, but just because I'm having so much fun with it. So now I'm going to turn this painting upside down, and I find it easy for this next stage, or easier. So, and if I keep it right side up, you'll see why in a minute, because I want to fill in this whole sky section. Oop, and my water is blue. That's fine. If I had clean water, that'd be great, but the blue makes it easier for you all to see what's happening anyway. So if I'm like this, you can see how I have to like contort my hand around to see that line. Because if I try to paint like this, my paintbrush is covering my pencil line, which is just not efficient at all. So I just turn it 180, and all of a sudden it's so magical and so much easier. I have nothing obscuring the line of that mountain along with my pencil, and voila, can fill in this whole upper nice area very nice and quickly. And I'll be kind of quick and dirty with my brush strokes for this whole entire zone until I get close to the top of that mountain. Then I'll slow down. I'm just going to put those marks in just like that. So there we go. Well, it's awesome, Michelle, you're homeschooling. That's so cool. And the classes are kid friendly. I have a handful of students now who are like, I think in the 7 to 12 range. They sign on with their parents and they do the classes together, which is just like, makes me so happy. And I also am really careful that I don't have any swear words or anything in there. I did get overzealous in my Alpinist class and dropped one little swear word that I edited out. The light show was just too pretty and I got too excited. But I do make sure that they're kid friendly in that respect. So I try to be really conscientious of that. All right, so now that I have my whole area filled in up here. Ooh, and I should mention before I forget, because I don't want to forget, as alumni, you guys do get access to like a little bit of a discounted rate for those Adventure Art Academy classes. I keep it really, I try to keep it super affordable to begin with, but you guys get a bit of a discount anyway. Yay, oh my gosh, Michelle, that's so fun. I hope it's a good fit for you all. I haven't been able to teach too many classes with kids, but the 8 and 10-year-old range is just such a beautiful age there. So, I feel like it has so much wonder still in their hearts about nature, and it's just so magical. So now that I have, before I get totally distracted thinking about kids and nature, I want that even sheen across the entire paper. If I start to get some puddling when I tilt my paper right here like I am, you can take your clean brush is the operative word, and you can just kind of lift that out with your brush, or you can just take the edge of a paper towel and just kind of drag it right along that little zone right there, and just very lightly that will kind of sop up that extra water. So now, just like based on what we practiced before, I'm going for kind of a middle concentration amount of paint. I'm going to tilt that paper up a little bit, 1 to 3 inches in the back, and just drop that paint right on the top. And depending on how wet my mixture is, I'll either have a lot of bleeding downward or not much bleeding. So you can see this was more wet mixture I just dropped in, and I'm getting a lot more bleeding of that paint down the paper. And where did this puddle come from? Like, what? Where were you hiding? Okay, so I'm gonna hit that whole edge again. I'm just being careful not to smear any dirty paint water onto the summit of my mountain, because as you can see, the paint goes where the water goes. So wherever there's water, the paint will follow. So if I keep this whole area dry, then that paint won't go over here. I think of the water as the mama duckling and the paint as the baby ducklings, and it will just follow it across your entire page. So definitely water awareness is helpful and key. So I'm very much enjoying all those patterns happening back there. I'm going to kind of make a little bit more diluted version of my sky color that I just used. So I didn't even rinse my brush. I just kind of tapped it in a new little spot on the palette, added some extra water. And with that slightly dilute color, I'm going to come in here and kind of drop some additional cloud shapes in kind of above my mountain. Because again, the reason for that is that I do need the top of this mountain to be differentiated enough from the really white of the snow for it to show up. So that's why dropping in those extra clouds can kind of help achieve that for me. I'm just gonna kind of blend this down. I'm gonna let this kind of whole zone do whatever it wants to do. If I want to, I can take that paper towel and I can kind of tap this bottom zone and kind of soften or darken some of those edges. It adds an interesting effect, I often find, to use the paper towel. And I can grab some kind of paint and like really to help define the upper edge of that mountain a little bit more. And you might notice too that I am again keeping these colors that we just put on kind of right in that middle zone of my values. I'm not too dark, not too light, because in our finished painting, the darkest values are reserved for this zone in the front, and also slightly less dark, but still quite dark, is our rock. So I can kind of come in here and have some fun kind of tapping out some clouds over here if I want to. The best cloud shapes come from like the most crimply part of your paper towel. And also, honestly, Kleenexes work even better, especially if they're, it's gonna sound gross, but used Kleenexes work the best because they have like some stiff parts and some like floppy parts once they're dry, not when they're wet. I know that sounds gross, but for some reason it works so well. I don't know why, but it gives me the most beautiful, unpredictable patterns. I never tell clients that, but they just work really well. And if you get grossed out by that, you can always take a Kleenex, like drop some water in it, crinkle it up, let it dry, and then it will have the fibers like change a little bit. So that's the sanitary way to do it. So my paintings sit for so long, I don't worry about it. Okay, so I'm happy with that sky. I'm not going to touch it anymore. If I touch it anymore, I'll end up losing patterns. And what's kind of fun is we can see how over here, those really distinctive lines we had in the beginning, they've all kind of diffused out. So there was enough water over here that those lines just kind of self-leveled, they went disappeared. Where over here, there was a slightly bit drier. So we ended up retaining some of those cool patterns in that in our painting. So yeah, that's all I need. You know, have it dark enough around the summit so we can see the snow, and that's ready to go. So let's go ahead and take a 5 or so minute break. So let's all reconvene at, let's just say 7:05. So we'll have some time to go run to the restroom, get a quick snack to bring back with you. I'm not averse to any, I can't see you, so any of the adults in the room, if you want to go get some adult refreshments, please feel free. I have my glass of water. And then we'll reconvene soon. And don't be afraid to drop any questions in the chat as well. And I'm going to go on mute and run quickly to refill my water bottle and go to the restroom. So I'll come back with the rest of you. I'm back and able to take questions. And I saw a note from Tracy asking if it's being recorded. And yes, you will get a recording from SheJumps, and that recording will be available for 2 weeks. That's just the limitation that Zoom imposes on cloud recordings. But no problem, you'll be able to catch up on the first 15 minutes. But you also didn't miss too much, Tracy. It was just intros and then going over materials, I think, for most of that time. So you caught most of the really important stuff, as long as you tuned in around 6 or 6:30 or so. And Rachel had a really useful question that was asking about using dry paint, and every so often you get small chunks of dry paint on my brush and the paper. What's a good way to avoid that? I'd love to know like what brand of paint you're using, Rachel, because sometimes different brands and even different pigments within certain brands are more prone to that than others. Like I have some granulating pigments that behave more like they're kind of sandier basically, and they will kind of tend to do more of that separation. I haven't had too much of a problem with that though in my Daniel Smith paints, honestly. But if you really get a lot of those chunkies happening, the one way to avoid that is to kind of, or it may not avoid it, but it might help. I'd be curious to hear. Is before you start painting with a color, you can kind of drop some water, like, and kind of get a nice little puddle kind of going on top of that color. And that will help kind of soften or kind of pre-wet a little bit of that color for you. So hopefully that will help. Yeah. In which are you using the dark blue in that Cotman watercolor set, Rachel? Is it the ultramarine blue? That one I think might be kind of more prone to that than other ones. Yeah. Yeah. So and since we're still on break, a little side note. So Rachel's question kind of brings up a note about different pigments and different pigment qualities. So the set that she has is a really awesome one that I highly recommend for folks who are just starting out. It's more accessible financially because they actually take the more expensive pigments, they'll substitute man-made versions of them that are more affordable. So you can bring down the cost of a palette really substantially. The one downside of that is that those paints tend to they're not quite as concentrated. So you might have to kind of swirl your brush around and use more paint than like I would in an artist quality paint. And if you think you're going to get into, Tracy, I am talking right now. And if you can't hear me, someone else let me know. I think I'm off mute. It might be, Rachel, let me know if you can't hear me or someone else who's here. Just want to make sure audio is working okay. Okay, great, thanks, Rachel. And it's possible, Tracy, you're still having some ins and outs, but the recording will hopefully fill in any gaps that you missed. But yes, what I was saying is if you think you're going to stick with watercolor for quite a while, then what you can do is I recommend buying a couple pigments of artist quality paints. Because that can help. I find it helps a lot to be able to have some of those higher quality paints in your palette. They just go a long way too. Like one tube will last me many, many years. I'm still trying to troubleshoot for Tracy. It seems like for everyone else, and if folks can hear me, so I'm back in action. Maybe it could be your connection, Tracy. So you can always try opening another window or different browser. Or just double checking that your computer and your phone aren't on mute or whatever device you're using. But unfortunately, I don't have too much ability to troubleshoot from afar. Okay, so Catherine asked if I have a different favorite brand aside from Art Toolkit. So Art Toolkit is just the palette. It's just if you imagine these pans are empty and then it's just the palette itself. And I've been using that for many, many years just because it's so light and compact. There's some other great palettes out there that you can usually find on any of the art stores that are kind of metal and folding, but they're a lot heavier because they carry also a bunch more paint that I don't end up needing. So from personal experience, I haven't really deviated from my Art Toolkit palettes just because I love them so much. And what do I love about the Art Toolkit palette? I can talk more about that at the end, but in short, it's light, it's compact, it has just enough paint to do even a half sheet painting or multiple half sheets during a longer trip. So it has, even these small pans, they have a lot of space, but mostly it's just the portability of it. And then they also have a big mixing space and they're also rust proof. So I don't have to worry about that. So little pans don't rust. And then they're also easier for me to clean. I can just pull everything out, dust them off, take a piece of, for a lot of folks who have dried paints, cleaning them can be intimidating. And we're often afraid to, there's cat hair in here, which is the bane of my existence. It can be hard to get the yellows clean again. I just take like my stiffest little like small acrylic brush or one of these brushes, pull the pans out and just like swirl around briefly under running water, and then just put it right back in the palette and it's clean. And you don't lose much paint that way either. So good questions. Okay, and hopefully Tracy, you can hear me again. If not, I'm so sorry. Okay. No, that's a perfect question, Catherine. Yes, I fill my pans from, and I can talk more about that at the end, but yes, I fill all of these from tubes, because the tubes are the easiest and the most affordable way by far to get a lot of paint. Because like from this little guy, I can fill, I don't know, like 8 full pans on my palette. And I mean, maybe it seems like a lot. I never deplete the pan all the way, so I don't have an exact estimate for you, but that's been the most efficient way, both in terms of like, you know, getting the colors I want, which, because I don't want to buy a set of the colors that are all over the place, but also in terms of getting, just having the cheapest possible in the long run. And you don't need this many colors, guys. It's taken me 6 years to buy all those colors because I hate spending a lot of money on art supplies. I know I shouldn't, but I do. I still shy away from it. So it's, you know, just like there's a handful that are useful in the beginning, but you certainly don't need like 20 colors. That's excessive. And I almost never use, like, I never use all of them. Each painting will have maximum 5 different colors. Okay, back to our painting. So hopefully our sky is dry enough now that we can actually go right into painting some of our rocks. That's kind of the next step along the way. And I'm kind of testing that by putting the kind of back of my hand fingertips. I find often leave more like little marks on there. So I'll use kind of the back of my pinky just to kind of see if it's dry. My paper is still a little bit cool, but I think we'll be good to go. A fun thing to kind of see is that over here I had some puddled water. And you can see how as this dried, it pulled that puddled water into the painting and kind of pulled the paint with it. So that's kind of an example of that capillary action in action on our paper, which is just like so cool. I'm always blown away by the effects of watercolor. So now for our rocks, I'm going to bring back out my test paper here just so I can kind of get this color really dialed in before I have to put it on my painting. Having a test paper or not being afraid to put some paint on the back of your painting is a really, really useful way to make sure that we have the right value of our color before we get started. So I'm just going to kind of make a couple little lines over here. That's feeling quite dark, honestly. I don't want to be, I'm reserving the darkest darks for my trees. So I kind of, again, if we're on our value scale, I want to be somewhere like right in here. So it's not as light as the sky, but it's a step or two above that. And if you end up darker, don't worry. We have that kind of beautiful faded zone down below where we lighten things up. So it'll still work even if our mountain gets quite dark. So that's feeling like a pretty good color. And the color I'm working with right now dries more dull than it appears wet, which is just kind of a funny thing to note about this shade called Indanthrone Blue. Some paints dry really true to color. Some paints like this one, they do not stay as vibrant as they first appear when I'm working with them. So I'm just going to start over here on the left side of my painting, because that feels like the lowest consequence zone. It's off to the side, like it's, you know, people aren't going to focus their eyes as natively on it. So I'm a big fan of starting in low consequence areas. And I'm going to begin by kind of, you know, adding in the paint on the upper part of this ridge, grab a little bit more paint. And then I'm just going to kind of start filling in this ridge line. And as I do, I'm looking for, if I had that reference image open, I'd be looking at kind of the shapes of that rock. I'm also leaving these little magical white spots kind of in my rock. The reason for that is that those little white spots serve double duty. They both add interesting texture and they can look like snow or highlighted rock. And they're just such an easy and fun way I've found to add a lot of texture and visual interest without having to paint every single little detail that I see. And as I get closer to the summit, I'm slowing down a little bit, making sure my brush is nice and pointy to kind of get these cool little rock patterns that kind of wrap right near the summit. I'm kind of putting those in. And then I'm going to kind of, you know, work my way down this, looking for kind of, you know, where are the thicker areas where there's no, you know, kind of snow or interesting texture showing through. And then where does those rocks kind of wrap across toward this other chunk. And if I'm getting kind of lost, I might migrate my attention to this other chunk of rock right here. When I'm painting with this brush, I'm not doing all the same brush strokes, right? Like I'm kind of going side to side or more down. So I'm trying to, just by the nature of the brush strokes I'm actually creating, I'm trying to add in a lot of natural and organic kind of shapes and variation there. So I try not to get too kind of locked in, don't want to get tunnel vision on one specific way of moving my brush across the page. And I got way too much paint on that pass in the palette. They're a little bit too dark again. So if that happened, just dip the very tip of the brush in the water, refresh with some lighter paint. I'm gonna make my way down. There we go. And in this zone right here, there's some kind of cool rocks that kind of wrap over and down. So that's really neat to see. And yes, you can see things are going in pretty quickly. Like I'm also looking for, maybe I'll squint at my reference image and kind of look for any big bands of rock like right here that I missed that I want to add in. So that's kind of a helpful little technique too, is that if we're kind of getting lost, we want to focus on the biggest shapes of our rocks, squinting can help a lot. Something I have to remind myself to do, and now just kind of find myself doing intuitively in a lot of different paintings. So now that I have this zone done, I do want to kind of put in some of the stuff down here before this, like I want this to kind of blend down a little bit. So before that dries too much, I'm going to dip that brush and rinse off most of the paint, but not all of it. Because if I test it again, you can see there's still some blue on there. So I just kind of like smash, oh, there's a little drop, smash that paintbrush on the bottom gently, and then pull it right back out. And then with this kind of quite diluted paint, I'm just going to kind of hit some of these, kind of overlap some of those little wet zones there, and then kind of migrate my way across, blend this downward. The reason I'm doing this now, again, is that I really do want to kind of have a seamless blending from that zone into this one. And the best way to achieve that was to do this zone right while that was still wet. And rinse that brush even more now, because I do down here want this to get quite light and with quite clean amounts of water. So it kind of continues to fade from a darker color to a lighter color. And I'm now down here working with quite a bit of water as I kind of migrate down these shapes. Again, leaving kind of more white areas. Those will kind of give the impression of snow or rock, whatever it needs to be. And I'm not going to go too overboard in this zone yet. Like I can always come back in and add more, but for now, I'm just going to kind of get a big, nice glob of wet paint and kind of slide it over that way. And then I'll kind of meet in this middle zone from the right side when we're ready to go over there. Woohoo. Any burning questions, or is anyone feeling lost about how that was done? And if so, I can try to explain it in another way. You can also, if you feel adventuresome, you can take some of your darker pigment and then kind of drop it into this wet zone and just kind of see what happens. And you can see if you like that kind of darker color blending in. If you don't, tap that brush mostly dry, and you can kind of lift out that color before it runs too much amok on the paper. I kind of like to do almost the opposite, where I'll grab some clean water and then drop that clean water into this. And that clean water, if I drop it into this damp zone, as it dries, we'll kind of push that paint around and make really interesting patterns. Quinn, I'm so glad that this technique is working for you. It's really fast and kind of furious. So some folks it just really resonates with, some find it kind of overwhelming and not as fun. So hopefully it's feeling fun for everybody. And if not super fun, at least it's feeling new and exciting. And one of the main things to keep in mind here is that we really do want to kind of have a minor gradient going from darker to lighter. Like, and if I want to encourage that, I could always lift out a little bit of paint from some of these zones while it's still wet. So just a very slightly damp brush, and I can kind of run it through these little zones. So I'm just going between painting and paper towel. You can actually lift out some of the paint from certain areas, but only where it's still wet. So that's kind of a fun thing to try as well. And that will have an interesting effect of kind of giving, if I zoom in, you can kind of see how it has that little bit of extra kind of dimensionality there. Yay. So I love this technique too, because it just saves me so much time. I feel way less overwhelmed, and I just trust that the viewer will decide, like, probably this has the, it could give some the impression Mount Rainier was snowier than it was. Do I care? No. Because what matters is I was able to paint this pretty quickly and with a lot of fun. So it doesn't matter to me if I don't have it exactly as it was. If I want to do an exact replica, I can go back to the studio when I'm home somewhere and I can spend 20 hours painting rocks. But for something like this, like I just want to give myself a chance to have fun and play and experiment. Before I move on to the right side, I recognize I didn't quite get this rock shape right. Like it does kind of fan out and get more broad. So I am showing you also kind of how you can add paint if you didn't quite have everything you wanted done. So I'm just kind of bringing it up and then down, and you can see how you can kind of blend those different layers and areas together. And because this stuff down here was still nice and wet, it'll kind of continue that faded area. If it wasn't nice and wet, if it's dried all the way, then what you could do is, if you imagine I'm putting a second layer of paint on here, like if this is my kind of rocky chunk, then before that dries, I just rinse my brush, tap off most of the water with that lightly damp brush, just do that same little kind of blending technique down and into that bottom area. So you can really achieve a very similar effect with ideally clean water. My water is not clean anymore. I'm also liking that I'm getting some kind of really cool patterning happening down here. I'm going to encourage that by putting some more water dropped, just kind of that roughly clean water dropped right into the bottom here to encourage more patterns to happen. But I'm ready to keep moving on to the right side. If you're feeling like you aren't quite caught up yet, just feel free to drop in the comments. You can send directly to me and I can wait a little bit longer here if folks need a bit more time. Okay, I'll give a few more minutes to hang out and get this zone painted in because we're doing great for time so far. Also, if you're feeling super stressed about falling behind because you aren't able to move as quickly as I am, don't worry about it. The way this painting works is that as long as you kind of have this kind of lighter blue stuff blocked in along the bottom, even if your rocks aren't all painted in, because the trees don't touch the rocks up there, then we can paint trees and you can come back to and finish them later, or watch the recording and that kind of thing. So I encourage you to not get too stressed out about if things don't get all the way done all the way. But while we're giving folks a chance to catch up, this is a great time to ask questions related to where we are in the painting or not. So open floor for a few minutes. Great question from Kelly. I think every question is a great question, so I'll just keep saying that. So she asked about stretching my paper. Do I stretch my watercolor paper? She thinks she's using the same one I am, which is an Arches 140-pound cold press, and doesn't seem to have as many issues with buckling on this kind of paper. So I don't personally usually tape my paper. I have gotten some buckling. So if I tilt it upward, we can see how that upper edge is kind of ruffled like that. So there is some buckling. I find that when we work as quickly as we all are tonight, the buckling is less noticeable. So it's kind of less prone basically to really bad buckling. Sometimes it will though. I found the Arches and is one of the more forgiving ones for that. So stretching your paper is where you might, you get it fully, tape it down or get it fully wet and then attach it to a piece of paper, to a block somehow. I've never bothered. I find that the way that I work, as you can see, is very, very loose. So if I end up with a little dish and it kind of puddles a little bit, that's okay. I can just soak up that water if I need to. And then I just don't worry as much about, having the kind of vagaries of pattern making, because I embrace blooms so much in my work. So I know a lot of artists who have great success with kind of taping things down and getting them pre-wet and that kind of thing. I usually just default to painting it. And then when I get back home, if it's really, really warpy, then I will just, once the painting is fully dry, get the back just a tiny bit wet with a big paintbrush, and then kind of take a paper towel and lift off as much water as possible. So it's just barely damp, sandwich it between two pieces of acid-free paper and put some books on top, and then it dries perfectly flat. So I can flatten small paintings, big paintings with that same method. So it works quite well. And also, to be honest, another reason that I don't like to stretch my paintings, especially smaller ones at home, is that it is a challenge sometimes to have the warping of the paper. And I find that I'm less frustrated by that warping when I'm outside, because I just don't have the tape resources and the time to prep everything by stretching it outdoors. So if I can kind of practice with the suboptimal conditions basically for some at home, then I find that I'm less prone to frustration when I'm actually outside. So it's kind of a personal, mildly masochistic choice to have rimples at home to make it easier when I'm actually out in the field, because that way I've had a lot of practice with how to deal with that and how to work around it or not, and to know when I need to soak up water or not. So a long answer to a short question. Yeah, I 100% agree, Kelly. Stretching is a pain in the butt, and I just don't have the patience. Like some days it's hard enough just to sit down and paint, and I don't want to spend out like 20 minutes or whatever taping and getting it wet. And that's when I can just flatten it. And I've never really found it to be too frustrating outside. Maybe when I'm painting in the desert, I'll find it more frustrating. I think things will curl more, but at home at least I find it okay. We're in Washington. Sometimes stuff doesn't dry at all, and I have the opposite problem. It's perfectly flat, but just everything is wet. So I'm going to go ahead and keep rolling on our lines on our mountain. And don't forget, we'll have more time to catch up after we get the rest of them in. So I'm going to go back and mix up some more of that nice color I was using. And you can see how this is drying a bit more dull and a little bit lighter than what I originally put down, or how it appeared when it was wet, which is what I was hoping for and knew would happen. That's kind of where color familiarity comes in. It's useful to know how our colors will behave. And that just comes from practice, spending some time with them. Okay. Left my water bottle across the room, but I'll go get it at the end of this little segment here. It's kind of dark and dreary today. It's like 7:30 and already getting kind of dark. I keep forgetting that it's September. I feel my brain still thinks it's August 3rd, which it definitely isn't, because on that day I was hiking, but it just doesn't feel like it should be September yet. I don't know about you guys, but it feels like the last month has gone by super fast. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right into these next chunks of rock. I have the right color, I think, and I can always adjust it once I put it on the paper. I'm going to kind of, and don't forget too, that if you're feeling like your paintbrush is not precise enough, it's kind of too wet or too kind of spread out the bristles, you can just kind of squeegee off some paint on the edge of the palette, and that will kind of arrange those bristles in a more precise pattern than if I were to like squish the paintbrush around on the palette. It's quite spread out. So a little squeegee in a corner can kind of help, or you can roll it if you don't have a corner, will also help to kind of tighten up those bristles. So I'm going to dive back into this top portion here and just kind of work my way down, again, leaving those nice little white spaces. And I do call them magical because, there's, in addition to the magical watercolor properties of watercolor, I just love the way those little white things can just stand in for so much. They leave a lot of beautiful room for interpretation for our viewers, but they can be texture, they can be snow, they can be whatever you want them to be. And if you have a base color beneath them, they can just be add more depth and interest. So, kind of, it was a technique I stumbled upon in 2019, was using a lot of white spaces, and kind of have been using it ever since as a shortcut as well in some cases for paintings. But here I have a bit too many, so I'm going to fill some in. I want a more thick and chunky rock there. Same thing down there. And this little band of rock over here on the right side. But as you can see there, like I tend to err on the side of having more little white spaces to start, because I could always fill them in, but I can never get that white space back. So I tend to leave more than I think I need to at the very beginning. I'm also trying to avoid like too many really parallel or similar shapes. So if I have something like this that happens where I have a swoop here and a swoop here, that's, at least for me, going to very much catch my eye because it's too parallel. They're very much too similar. So if that happens, I'll just kind of come back in here and break up one of those shapes somehow and transform it and change it. So that way they aren't as similar as they were. And that's often also where squinting can really help, because if I squint, I find it easier just to kind of pick out those shapes, or if I'm working on a painting longer than like our lesson today, I'll take a photo of it, because sometimes in a photo, I can better see those weird little things I didn't expect, or I can find areas that aren't reading quite correctly on the small screen. So that was a really big help to me once I got a little bit nicer phone years ago, and it helped so much to be able to see better what was happening in my painting. Okay, time to move on to this little chunk of rock. Well, I say little, it's actually huge on the mountain, but on our painting, it's little comparatively to everything else. So here's some kind of rocky sections coming down here. Again, trying to avoid having too much parallel patterning happening. I'm just gonna boop that down there. And that got longer than it was and how it is in my actual painting. Does not matter. It's just still gonna read as a chunk of rock. Doesn't matter if it's longer or shorter or not exactly where it goes. No one but you will know unless you tell them. And honestly, the only people who will know are climbers. And if they see you out painting and they see a painting, it's super rare you're ever going to have a painter be like, actually, that little chunk of rock is like 2 miles too long. And you really like, no, it just doesn't happen. I've had it happen like twice, but it was all in good fun and good nature. And they were asking me, it was intentional that I omitted like an entire chunk of a ridgeline. And I was like, yes, because it was too complex. I didn't want to paint it. Or I was running out of time, whatever it was. So it's fun. And now I'm going to dive into, I also am going to double check my reference image here because I'm not quite sure what happens. Okay. Yeah. And I've, like I've changed a lot compared to my reference image, and that's a-okay. Like these two are kind of more connected. So if I want to connect them, I can. You can see how that makes it feel like it's more rocky. And if I were to put even more rocks in this zone, it will also kind of change the feel from more snowy to more rocky. So it kind of truncates and moves those big glacier shapes around. So now I'm going to migrate over here to this shape. So, and it actually doesn't start where I put that line, it starts more over here. And this one, I'm going to kind of be brave and start right on the upper edge instead of along the bottom. So I just want to kind of go big and just get it out of the way. It's a common theme among, and I'm sure if I have any of my Adventure Art Academy students here, they know very well that like, and I'm very open with those part of my process of being like, well, this is terrifying. So we're just going to go for it and hope for the best. Because sometimes that's how painting can feel. It can feel like, even if we're 20 feet from our car, just because we're painting, it can feel like a really being way outside the comfort zone. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I love it so much. And one of the reasons why I love getting to teach it. And by filming my classes outside, I get to invite all of you, if you choose to join those, kind of on that same adventure with me, which is just so fun to me. So I'm making my way across and down and kind of putting in chunks of rock wherever I think they need to go. I'm going to fill that in, kind of fill this in. So this side is getting more filled in rock because it is kind of farther off to the side of the mountain. We're getting less, getting farther away from the summit. So we'll just kind of by nature have more kind of bigger rocks. And then of course, as we start to get into this zone, I now can switch to dipping that paintbrush in clean water, wiping off some of that paint, wipe off even more, I think. I'm going to switch to and I'm trying to recall to leave some white space in this zone too, as I'm filling in with the darker color, with the clean water. Well, clean is a remote term to describe my water at this point, but, and the more water I use here, you can see it's quite wet. I don't shy away from that. That will just kind of give me extra interesting patterns and shapes and things happening in that piece. And I'm, this is kind of in the part of a painting often where I'm usually tired and hungry and just kind of want to get some things down. So I'll just kind of be like, okay, there's some rock. Then I'll rinse that brush off a little bit and maybe put a little bit more kind of rock going up like that. And maybe I'll drop in some darker color like right in here because I want to reinforce that kind of hierarchy of values and depth. So the big reason, and I can't recall if I mentioned this or not, the big reason that I left all of this kind of lighter zone down here was really to create a sense of depth. So you can imagine that if we had this whole mountain be exactly the same kind of value range from top to bottom, and trees pasted on top, those trees just wouldn't show up very well. And it'd be harder to tell how far away the mountain was. So by doing it this way, we can really kind of build in this beautiful sense of depth in our paintings. And I'm going to put some water there, drop in some clean water in some places here. So we kind of take this color over here a little bit, which is feeling like, no, that's feeling kind of like challenging. So I'm going to quickly tap that out and make that easier on myself. So I'm going to have these lines just go right up to each other instead of having them overlap too much. And I can put some trees right there to cover that line if you have the same thing. This is feeling kind of boring up here. So I'm going to drop some clean water into this section to encourage some patterning to happen. So wherever I still have some wet paint, I can pump some clean water in. And that will actually, as you can see there, I hope you can see, I'll try to zoom in a little bit. You can see how that is now, oh yeah, there we go. That clean water is pushing that paint around and building in some really beautiful rocky textures for me. And I do that all the time. So often I want my water, like right in here, to do all that hard work for me. And that is just by dropping in some clean water when things are still wet and just saying, okay, have at it, paint. Whatever you want to do, I will embrace and be okay with. All right, and I'm gonna come over here, putting just a little bit of dark paint kind of right there, just to kind of bring that down. And this is also looking, this is kind of standing out to me a little bit as being too light in comparison. So I want to put a little bit of dark paint right there. And if it feels like this is kind of pasted on, that's supposed to. So once this layer dries, we'll come back in with some nice light color and add a little bit of shadowing next to it that will really anchor and ground these tones into the painting. So for now, it's everyone's are going to feel like that kind of a slight disconnect between rock and snow, but that will be alleviated by adding shadows. Sometimes I'll add the shadows first. I always get asked, so I figured I would just preclude the question. You know, if I'm working in multiple layers of paint and I'm really concerned about these details disturbing the shadows below, or if I have a really big swath of shadows, then I will, like if I wanted this whole thing here to be shadowed, I would have painted that in first. But since I'm doing, the sun is right here shining on the whole thing, I can kind of get away with doing it after the fact, which is a lot faster and also a lot easier if I don't have to plan out beforehand every single little shadow placement. And you'll see how that works in just a few minutes. Okay, we are in a dry time intermission, so the floor is open for any and all questions you guys might have, so feel free. It's also a great opportunity to kind of literally lean back in your chair away from the table. I'm just looking for any spots that are kind of really standing out to me kind of weirdly. And the only place that's doing that is just kind of right in here. I actually do want a little bit of dark paint to kind of swoop up into that zone. This is a pretty dirty part of the glacier. So and I can't recall if this is the Nisqually over here or a different one, but the kind of texture and patterns of our glaciers is really amazing, because it helps it's a visual way to see the story of what's happening. Over the course of the season, that snow will melt and reveal the blue ice. And some years like this year, we can see exposed blue ice super duper high on the mountain, which tells us that it's been a really bad year for snowpack and for the glaciers. And we actually had some pretty unprecedented snowpack loss during those heat waves, as well as we've lost quite a bit of glacial ice. I was on Mount Baker with some scientists earlier this year, and it was one of the worst years they've ever seen for recession. I feel like that's one of the reasons why I love painting outside, because I think painting is uniquely suited to honing our skills of observation and giving, at least for me and hopefully for others, kind of a way to see what's happening in the landscape in a way that might have been hard without the help of our paints. And for fun, I'm going to come down here and put some clean water in here and try to encourage some pretty blooms to happen. So, timing for blooms is something that just kind of comes with experience and knowing your paints and your tools. I knew that it was ready for it because it was just starting to lose its sheen. Like over here, I can probably create some pretty strong ones too. So once it's less shiny, because you can see now where the new water got put in, it's more shiny, and where it was before, it was a little more dull. So that's kind of a little tool there. And I probably could have waited even a little bit longer. It's kind of just pushing the paint instead of making a bloom, but that's okay. All texture is good texture in this experimental style of painting. What questions do you all have? Because we'll probably, depending on how long our trees take us, we might end up going right up to our 8 o'clock time. And if I need to, I can stick around a little bit, but while we're waiting for stuff to dry, is a great chance for the questions. Oh, and there's something that we can do right now that's actually super useful to do right now. And that is to put our base color down here. Because as you can see here, this base color in between the white or in between the darker is actually not white. It's kind of it's that light tone. So I almost forgot that. Oh my gosh. So go ahead and grab kind of a nice light blue and just kind of cover up this whole zone down here. And something that's kind of useful is just to leave a big white border along the top here. So don't let your paint that you're putting in right here touch the wet zone above. If they do, it's totally fine. They'll just blend and bleed together. But if you want to encourage them to not, that little white border, again, will act as that traffic cop. So it will keep this paint from blending with the paint above it. But in this case, it does not matter at all because it's the same value effectively. So I'm just putting down kind of a nice light base layer in this whole zone. You have a hairdryer. This is the perfect opportunity to enact hairdryer and let it help dry things along. And is it Sari or Sari? I'm not sure how to pronounce it correctly, your name, but the style of painting I was saying is a more experimental style of painting, or another word is loose. So I tend to paint quite loosely, which means as a group and as a community tonight, we're embracing the kind of unpredictability of our medium and trying not to be too precise and too stuck on all the exact details. So I really have kind of come to the word experimental to feel really, it feels really true when we're outside because we're collecting visual data about a place. And I kind of love that tie to science in using that terminology, that like, we're not being afraid to try new things and to see what we'll discover and learn in that process. So trying to encourage this to dry. And I very well may end up popping out the hairdryer. But since I know all of you just added some color too, I don't want to get too far ahead of you. We can take one more question now, then we'll go in and add our shadows, and then we'll go on to our trees. So who has a question? And don't be afraid to ask questions that aren't directly related to this painting as well. It's okay as long as they're art adjacent. That's great. Nancy asked, she said that she's afraid to paint the trees. I always am too before I start them. How do you get the lines fine enough? So what I would recommend, Nancy, is kind of doing some tests before you start painting those trees to see how kind of fine of a point you can get on your paintbrush. So if I just like swirl that paintbrush around in my palette, I'll slide it over so you can see better. So I'm just swirling it around, not paying attention to like what my bristles are doing. Then I'll just kind of get like, you know, a random kind of, you know, marks on that I can make. They're not as fine as I would like. But if I intentionally kind of go to the edge of my palette and I kind of slide that paintbrush, so what I'm doing is I'm sliding it off the edge and I'm turning it 180 and then sliding it again. I'll show that here so maybe you can see it better. So I swipe the brush, turn it 180 and swipe it again. What that does is you can see we get and doing it at that weird angle didn't do it super great, but you can see how on one direction we have a pretty broad tip, and the other it's very, very narrow. So I have the option of I can make broad brush strokes, or I can use the narrow side. So that's kind of a useful thing that I have found by just kind of how we squeegee our brush out of our palette. And if you don't have an edge, you can just kind of tap it on one side and flip it over and tap the other side, or kind of slide it across your palette, and that will achieve the same effect as well. And with that more narrow pointed, you know, now with even a round brush, I can get those more narrow lines that give me more control. And if after you try to kind of squish those bristles where you want them and you're still not getting the kind of level of thinness that you want, then that is a materials limitation and not a you limitation. So please never feel like, you know, if you aren't doing something exactly right, that's usually not your fault. It's usually a materials thing that's making it harder for you than it otherwise would be. And Michelle had a question about whether I use pastel chalks. I have never tried pastel chalks, and I've been so curious about them. There's an incredible artist who I believe uses chalk pastel named Zariah Foreman, and she is one of the artists I most look up to, and she makes these huge chalk pastel paintings, and they just like blow my mind. Years ago, I got to see some in person, and I could not believe what she created, these chalk pastel paintings. Just like literally blew my mind. And ever since I've been curious, but I've just been having too much fun working in watercolor and now acrylic to add a third medium to the mix. Okay, so I think we have, like, I was checking my mountain, and like, if I avoid this little zone right here, this stuff up here is dry enough for me to add my little delicate kind of glacier textures and shadows. So this color is a lot lighter than anything we've used so far. So I'm gonna mix up kind of a nice light, watery chunk of paint over here and a clean spot on my palette. And if you're on a palette like this, you can do the same thing. Just kind of go off to the side and make a nice little diluted section. And I am, as always, going to test that color I have, making sure it is in fact light. That's not light enough. I'll rinse that brush off, tap the extra moisture off that brush. Too light, dip it in the paint, pick up a little bit, and that's feeling just about right. So that's kind of, you know, having test paper is super duper handy for any and all painting. So now that I have that color on my brush, and again, I don't want this to be too wet. You know, I'm not going for this level of wetness. I don't want it puddling and running off my finger or the tip of my brush. I want just enough that I can make kind of lines on my finger and also on the page. So watercolor is made much easier. I found that once we kind of encourage ourselves to be really aware of how much water we have on our brush. So now with this nice light, delicate color, and make sure it actually is in fact light and delicate and not too dark, I'm going to come in here and just in a few places kind of add some shadowing. That's still a bit too dark, so you can see how that's not super light yet. I'm going to rinse that brush off and then come in and try again. And that's feeling more light now. And I'm just barely touching the edges of the lines I've already painted. If I just barely touch them, they won't get disturbed too much and they won't bleed everywhere. So I can kind of add in some shadows there. And here I can put in some kind of little curved lines that look like glaciers. Grab a little bit more paint. I can do the same thing here. These are really simple little lines. They're kind of like, pseudo little swooshes at different angles. And it really does not take many of them. That's the key here. So I'm doing as few of these little lines as possible to be able to tell the story I want them to tell without going overboard. I can do a bigger section here if I want to put in like a whole shadow. I kind of like the way that gave some movement and fun patterning to that section. Up here near the top of the mountain, I have just a few little lines right there. There's also just a few little lines coming down the top of this glacier. And I'm simplifying so much. Like I'm probably ignoring 98% of the detail in this glacier. But I just, one, don't have the time or the patience to want to paint all of that. And I think I even got a few too many lines down there. It's okay. It still works. It still reads well enough. And then over here where the glacier is a little bit dirtier, I can kind of blend some of that color off to the side. I'm just going to add in, and I'm using the angle of my brush strokes here to kind of reflect the angle of those glaciers and kind of the way it curves in or slides down. Because glaciers are not static. They don't just sit there. They actually do move. They are kind of like a very slow moving, very chilly pot of honey that's sliding down the mountain. Not the best analogy, but it kind of works. And that's probably just about all I need. I'm going to put a little bit more of that dark color over here. I'm going to put a little bit more of it kind of right in here, maybe a little bit there and there. And then that's all I'm going to do for that. And I'll just kind of lean back and look for any obnoxiously overly white areas, like right there. And then also right here needs a little bit. And then there we go. That's all it takes. Does not need much. I'm also very enthralled and happy with how this area here dried. The extra water you can see put in some just like really cool patterns. So you can see where I didn't time it right over here. It was still too wet. That extra water just kind of blended in and didn't do much. It actually, it was so wet that water went here and made it darker here. Over here, I timed it better. So it carried the paint just enough to kind of make some patterns appear, which is like, this is my favorite way to paint, just to let those patterns do all the hard work for me. I'm testing the bottom there. Okay, how did the glacier and shadowy patterns go for folks? Okay, thanks for the reply, Catherine. All good here. And I invite you to check the left side of your painting and see if these areas are dry enough to be able to start doing things. Mine are so close, they're still a tiny bit chilly. So as like a little side note that's kind of useful is like, if a paper still feels really cold to the touch, even though you're not lifting or disturbing paint anymore, it might still end up bleeding a little bit, especially if you're outside. Like here, this is still kind of chilly here. Like I can actually lift that paint off. But I've been really surprised sometimes where I'm like, I thought that was dry, and then it just like bleeds everywhere because it was dry. It wasn't lifting, but it was still chilly, and that tells me that there's still evaporation happening, so it's still wet enough for that to work. And Allie, thank you for the vulnerability and sharing your comment. It is so hard to leave enough white, especially if we're trying it for the first time. So don't be hard on yourself. Like we're here to play and experiment and try. And the first few times we try it, it's like, it feels very, very foreign, honestly, because it's kind of a weird way of painting. It's a big time shortcut, saves a ton of time, but it can be kind of weird. Rachel feels like you left too much white. Rachel, you're just painting Mount Rainier with a big, beautiful blanket of snow on it. And Michelle, they definitely can look like ski runs from a distance, which is kind of cool. This technique works really well if you're ever having to paint a ski resort. I've done it once, I wouldn't do it again, but okay, I'm ready for some trees. And the way the trees are going to go down is that I'm going to do them, I'm going to start over here. I'm going to paint in this section. Then I'm going to put in kind of the bottom swoopy patterns for our foreground. And then I'm going to migrate over here into these trees. And I'm going to do these almost at normal speed, not too far off. So I just invite you, if you want to just watch and then rewatch the recording or follow along with me. But the main reason I'm saying that with the whole preview is just that I don't want you to feel bad if you are not able to work at the same speed. I've been practicing painting trees for 10 years. So just take a nice big deep breath and embrace how whatever pace your tree painting pace is, it's likely a bit slower, and that is okay. And I'll tell you when I'm doing something that's useful to watch, like filling in the bottom, so that way you can go back to painting your trees while I'm working on mine. And for these trees, I'm going to be working in the darkest value of my painting. So creating a true dark color in this. So I'm using my blue at kind of full concentration now. If I test that color, you can see it is very, very dark. And that's not even quite dark enough. So I actually need a tiny bit more paint. And I can just, for fun, I can use my little pan, because I haven't used that yet. So if I was using a dry little pan, and if I want full concentration color, I ended up just swiping that brush through that pan, adding a tiny bit of water so I can kind of agitate that to disturb it. And that will give me a really, really dark amount of paint. And you can even squeegee your brush in your pan too. You can kind of go one side, flip it over to the other side. So now I have that really nice dark paint. And I want, not a ton of water, but enough water that's not going to dry right away. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to start by adding in a few of my trees that actually do have some little branches off them. Kind of going nice and fast, like just trying to dance that brush across the page. And in between my trees, I'll kind of do some of those far away tree techniques. Put in another tall little guy here. Dancing the brush around. And if I end up with a tree shape that's not quite right, like don't worry about it. And once I get about an inch or so, I'm just going to dip that brush in the water and then just kind of put some like water right below these trees. So what I want to do is keep the bottom of them from drying as fast, so that then I can get a more seamless blend with the bottom. So every like inch or so, I'll kind of go back and add some more water to the bottom, which can be kind of nice. There's another happy little tree, channeling our inner Bob Rosses with all these trees we have to paint. And if you're feeling like you don't want to paint trees that have branches, then don't. Just paint trees that are far away the whole way across. People will still think it looks beautiful. So then I can have this little guy, dip that paintbrush in the water, and bring this all the way across. I had a cool little like white gap there that I'm going to leave. So I'm going to try not to cover that all the way up. I'm going to add some more water right here. Again, the reason for that is I'm trying to keep this bottom zone from drying out too much as I go across the page. So right here, let's say I'm getting bored of painting trees. I can just paint those little kind of up and down marks. Right here, I'll make a few more tall ones. And don't worry about it if you get, a little bit, your paint isn't exactly consistent all the way across. That's okay. It doesn't have to be perfectly consistent with every single pass of the color. So it's not a problem if you have some that are darker and some that are lighter and that kind of thing. And there's a little tree right there. Okay, now I'm going to go across and get that little bit there. Okay, so I'm about halfway. As I approach this middle section, I'm just going to kind of put in some little tree shapes, nothing too fancy. There we go. And then I do want to paint in this whole bottom section while it's still nice and wet and reactive. So I'm just going to dip that brush into the water. It still has a lot of paint on it. That's what I want. I'm going to come in here and just kind of do some nice swooping lines, trying to leave kind of these cool gaps in between. I want to carry the paint all the way to the corner over here. And as I kind of come into the middle, just kind of leave some kind of neat little swoop lines. And I'm using a lot of water, like a lot. And just letting and trusting that this paint up here, I can kind of slide it over if I need to. Trusting that that paint will kind of move over and start working with me. And I'm intentionally also making this quite wet over here, because that way when I put the trees on it, it'll just blend downward. So I'm kind of putting, filling in some of these gaps, making these lines smaller or bigger. And these, lines that are swoopy will just kind of give the rough impression of patterns in our foreground, which will save us a lot of time. We don't have to paint all those details. No crazy rocks today. I can add in some darker paint on this side if I want to kind of give a slight vignetting effect. This other side, the paint bled down so beautifully. I'll kind of lean back and see, okay, do I have any crazy patterns that are repeating all the time? Yes. This pattern here feels kind of obtrusive. I'm just going to get rid of it. And then this guy feels too big. And then that's feeling pretty good. So we're going to call that the way that works. So we're going to call that pretty good for now. I'm just kind of paying attention. If I get a big puddle because my page isn't taped down, I can kind of just tilt that page and let it run. Be like, ooh, look at that. Look at that. That's going to be cool. I have no idea where it's going to end up, and I'm just going to let it go all the way across that page for fun. So that's kind of a cool thing to do sometimes too, is just say, hey, I have no idea how this is going to turn out, but we're going to go for it just in case. And if I decide, like right over here, this is feeling too like well organized, what I mean by that is like this line is too the same all the way across, just drop in some dark paint and be like, boop, dark paint, some swoops, add some more kind of vignetting on that side. And now you kind of bring that foreground effect all the way to the bottom edge. But I still have some more trees to paint. So I'm going to keep rolling. And again, if you fall behind, just take a nice big deep breath. Okay. So now I'm just going to be painting trees. So you guys can go back to just working at whatever pace you wanted after we demoed that bottom section. Got a little drop of paint there by accident. I can just take my finger and smear it across. And to save some time, I'm going to kind of come in here and just like add a bunch of little tree shapes. I'm going to make my brush more fine tipped as I go. Make some taller, make some shorter. And from those tree shapes, I can decide where I want the bigger ones to stick up. So I'm deciding I want one to go right here. Sometimes it's kind of helpful just to have that bottom row of trees in before I start diving into the actual kind of more detailed ones. Again, making sure I try to keep all of them nice and kind of loose and having some variation. Okay, kind of going across, gonna keep rolling. The other side benefit of kind of doing a whole really dark row of these kind of little like trees that are far away, and as I can just kind of drop in that dark paint and make sure that I can maximize, like right now, if you aren't looking at these two, you can see I just dropped in some really dark paint along this upper portion and then kind of blended it down in some more swooping brush strokes. That allows me to maximize the visual interest of this kind of magical moment when this is all still wet. And I can get rid of some of that white or I can keep it. If I were to wait too long, then this would start to dry and I'd lose the ability to add that really pretty input. So that's why I was more precise with my trees here, and over here, once this bottom part was wet, switched to being kind of more fast and furious, and then going back and adding the bigger ones after the fact. So very kind of intentionally moving between one part of the painting and the next. And then, that just comes with time to know how, when to make those decisions like that. Just, you'll make a painting and be like, oh, I wish I would have done that differently. And you'll know next time, what the right or the easier order would have been to do things in. Because you can certainly fix a bottom section like that, if you need to add more dark, but it usually won't ever be quite as organic as it was with the first pass of color. We'll never get quite as much variation or unexpected results. So putting in a nice big tree over here. And I just love this color right now. I wish it would stay like this. Unfortunately, it won't. It's going to dry and a bit duller, but it's fun to admire it at this stage right here. It's such a dark, beautiful color. If I really had wanted this to retain this really vibrant, kind of more bright version of this color, then the trick to get around that for this indanthrone blue is to actually mix in some phthalo blue green shade with that color. Just when we're working dark like this, the phthalo blue will help keep that vibrancy even after it dries. So that's a little secret tip I've discovered to how to make this color stay really gorgeous, even when I'm working with it on different paintings. Okay, then I kind of brought those trees up higher on the side, and I just kind of wanted to. I felt like the right thing to do over there. I've got a nice big puddle in the middle again, so I'm going to tilt the painting a little bit and let those puddles run to the left this time. That's kind of cool. But actually, they might be kind of drying to the left, so we're just going to let it go to the right now and see what happens over there. Right and down, see what happens there. Ooh, there they go. Okay. And I'm going to again lean back and look for any kind of funky little areas. I don't know what's happening here. We have a weird little bald rectangle right here. So I'm just going to drop in some dark paint just to kind of fill in that bald rectangle. I didn't really want that. There we go. And I can add in some more dark little swooshes. Those will kind of just blend in. And I am being careful. I knew this was still wet enough over here to receive input and not disturb anything. So I could put that in and not have it mess up my painting. But that brings me to the end of the whirling dervish tree section. So I want to open the floor for any more questions, and I will stick around for a bit extra past 8 to answer any that are lingering. So please just kind of keep painting along. I'll be here at least five more minutes. So we still have 5 more minutes, so take your time. And unfortunately, I think because we're a webinar, normally if I was, when I'm hosting a smaller group, we were about 40 tonight. For a non-webinar format, that I'd have you all share some of your work. So I'd love to hear in the comments anything that you felt that went really well or was a challenge, or any kind of aha, interesting moments. I'd love to see that in the chat. That's kind of that's our primary way of being able to interact. And while you're doing that, I want to extend just a heartfelt thank you to SheJumps for hosting us. They're such an amazing organization. And if you live in any areas they have events, I highly encourage you to check them out. I'm going to be teaching in another class, a very different one for SheJumps in November. I think on the 4th, that will be all about sketching and painting outside. So kind of diving into some of the really concrete techniques that I've developed over time to make that process fun and easy and a bit more accessible. Thank you, Rebecca. She was saying her organic swoopies need a little bit more work, but you're not mad about it. Yes, that is such, Rebecca, that is the aspirational attitude right there. And I love to see it because, you know, painting, it should be fun, right? And I feel like I went through a couple of years where I put so much stress on myself that when I went outside or was in the studio, I had to poop out a masterpiece every time because Instagram played a big part in that, of creating this mentality of perfection. And once I let go of that, and I still struggle with it, let's be real, but I have so much more fun now. Like I experiment and I just know I'm not going to poop out a masterpiece every day. And I find that if I can approach each painting with that attitude, I have more fun and I think I paint better too. Yay, Quinn, I'm so glad you enjoyed how the words you used were specific yet free that the techniques were. And that's kind of my goal, is to give you guys, you know, very concrete tools that you can then have as much latitude as you want to make them. And thanks again, Catherine, for your kind comment. Yeah, so for those of you, I've mentioned it a few times already, but if you enjoy this class and want to keep learning from me, the Adventure Art Academy is my it's a monthly subscription class. So for you or alumni, $19.50 a month. I try to keep it really accessible. And I also have a sliding scale. So even after you get that alumni link, like please email me if that cost is in any way a burden to you. It brings me a lot of joy and it causes me no problem to extend a greater discount if you need it. So please just reach out to me if that's the case for you. But those classes are filmed outside and it's just so fun. And they're, this kind of process with like mosquitoes, and thankfully you guys don't have to deal with bugs. And you'll hear me get mad at the bugs and like swat at them and make mistakes. And I feel like I learned that's half the magic of it. And I really try to retain, the totality and just the honesty of that experience in those classes, because nothing ever goes to plan ever. But that's where the fun comes in. Yeah, thank you all for being here. And again, you'll get a follow-up email likely from SheJumps. And then if for some reason that email doesn't come through, just please do reach out to me. My email is claireswanderings@gmail.com. And you are more than welcome anytime to email me. I get a lot of emails. So if you don't hear from me for a week, please just write back. That is not an offensive thing to do. That's like the loving nudge I sometimes need for your email to resurface back to the top. So please feel free. Oh, I also have a new email. If you want to write this one down, it's claire@adventureartacademy.com. And that's just for students and alumni. So that's probably an even easier way to get a hold of me. Michelle left a comment that she felt like she was reflecting on the quality of tools and what a big difference that makes. And oh my gosh, and you were using your kids' Crayola watercolor set on computer paper. Oh my goodness. I applaud you, Michelle. That is so hard to do. But yeah, kids like quality paints are extraordinarily difficult. I used some recently and I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder watercolor was this mind-boggling, crazy hard thing as a child. Because the pigment just doesn't do anything that you want it to, and it's very opaque and kind of heavy. So yeah, Michelle, I encourage you to keep playing. If you have any questions about materials or kind of where to start for materials, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to send you kind of some ideas for starting out. Thank you, Rachel, for your kind comment. I appreciate it so much. And please keep painting, all of you, whether you're a new or an established artist, just like keep trying new things. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. A lot of these techniques came about from making a lot of really not very good paintings. And not many of them saw the light of day, and they may never. I'm trying to get better about showing at least sections of the ones that don't turn out online, just because I want folks to be able to see that like this is, it's not a perfect process. And Michelle, having it look like a preschooler painted it, I mean, what a beautiful way to return to that childlike wonder and that beginner's mind. So I think that at least that's how I try to interpret it and see it, because We all have those painting days. Thank you, Kelly, for coming to a second class with me through SheJumps. Great to have you again. Our last class was huge. We had well over 200 people in our workshop on Alpenglow on Mount Rainier from the webcam view at Crystal. And I'm contemplating teaching that one again, maybe later in November. So if that's something of interest to folks, I am putting that one back on the radar possibly. Thank you, Nancy, for coming, and thank you, Mandy, for making the intro. I always appreciate it when you all refer each other and send each other my way. I started teaching online last year with the pandemic, and this space of online teaching has been the biggest silver lining for me personally, and what has been just a crazy, hard year that continues to be crazy and weird and unexpected. And you guys are just, I feel so grateful every time I get to teach. So I want each and every one of you to know how incredibly grateful I am for your presence and the gift of your time this evening, because it really is a gift to get to share this with you. Chandra, I'm glad that your 6-year-old joined you for part of the time. That's wonderful. I've heard from some of my students in the Adventure Art Academy that their favorite thing their kids liked was actually, I made like a 16-part or 15-part little intro to outdoor painting that goes over a bunch of these kind of techniques, but broken down in really short sections. And I heard from parents that their kids love that the best, because they, the other sections are more in depth, but they just had so much fun, like learning how to paint rocks and trees and mixing colors. So that might be if you decide to take those classes, that could be a great place for the 6-year-old to start and to play with. Yay, thank you all. And in case I always get asked too, the classes I film outside are all broken up into pieces. They vary from like a couple minutes to about maximum 20 minutes, I think. And that's very intentional. One, because drying time, as you saw in this painting, like there's very natural breaks in how a painting works. We have to let it dry. And I also wanted to just like make my classes accessible. So both here by building in time for questions, and then for the asynchronous classes where you don't take them live, to create space where if you need to leave and come back, or you have a fussy kid, or like dog needs to go for a walk, or you're hungry, which is always me, you can come back and leave that lesson and you won't be negatively impacted, which is why I tried to build in some extra time into this one too. So the same thing kind of carries over, and that same philosophy carries over to the other classes too. Any last questions? I've been yakking and enjoying all of your comments, so I'll be quiet for a tiny bit to let you guys write any questions in there. Thank you all for the kind comments. It just means so much. Like I put a lot of thought and intentionality into planning every class, and knowing that things are working or not working, or just hearing the feedback means so much. And again, if you don't hear from, because the SheJumps email may come through Eventbrite, so double check wherever the Eventbrite stuff gets stuck in your email, because again, that will have your alumni discount link, the resource guide, and I also may have a slight discount for Art Toolkit. I need to ask if it's still active. I'm going to try to get one in time if I can. It's been a hot sec since I did a live Zoom class. So I'm going to try to have that, but no guarantees there. But yeah, if for some reason you don't get those follow-up materials, just write down my email, either one, but the best one is the claire@adventureartacademy.com. You can also go to either of those two websites, and you can find that email there too. So there's multiple ways to get a hold of me, or Instagram. I try to check Instagram somewhat too. Well, okay, let's be real. I check Instagram a lot, but I sometimes miss the messages. So just reach out to me somehow, and we'll get connected. Look forward to seeing you in some more classes, Michelle. Well, I forgot to mention, there is also a monthly live component to my outdoor classes. So even though those are all pre-recorded, once a month we get together. It's either at 4:30 or noon. So folks who are international can tune in. And also East Coasters, like every other month, can have an easier time for them. So we get together for a live demo and kind of community questioning and talking about colors and painting. And if any of you have questions, like I mentioned, about materials or anything with art, just reach out, especially if you're just starting out and you don't really know what supplies you want to start with. please reach out. And I never want folks to feel like they have to buy super expensive stuff. You don't. There's a few things that make a huge difference materials wise. And there's some things that don't make a difference at all. And I'm happy to demystify that a bit for folks. Okay, well, I am gonna go eat some late dinner. I had a donut earlier and it was delicious. So now I'm gonna go eat some non-donut food. But thank you all for being here. Again, such an honor, and sending all of you a big virtual high five and a lot of gratitude for your presence today. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.